This podcast is part of the Dark Myths Collective. Visit darkmyths.org to discover more shows like this one. The darkness awaits.
It's about to be a fun ride. Follow along, watch as we slide. Paranormal just hit the lights. Goosebumps all through the night. Mixing just a little bit of twain. That girl sure can't do a thing. Together hillbillies go insane. Laugh so hard it'll hurt your brain. Podcast you won't ever change. These two here, they got the recipe. Sit on back and listen in to some of our darkest mysteries, eh?
Welcome to Hillbilly Horror Stories. And now here's your hosts, Jerry and Tracy Polly, and their dog Ninja.
Greetings, guys and ghouls, and welcome to Hillbilly Horror Stories. Before we start tonight's show, please have a listen to this promo of a podcast that we think is to die for.
They say I'm disturbed.
From city to city, an incredible hysterical panic spread.
This is about to get weird.
Join John, Brent, and Conspiracy Bot each week as they clarify conspiracies,
It's the first time euphemism's ever been used in this show, and I appreciate you calling me out on it.
explore enigmas,
Disregard all known writing and use my method, which only works on this. You'll realize it says drink rich chocolatey Ovaltine inside the spaceship under the Sphinx.
and probe the paranormal.
Hold on a second. I'm pointing the laser at the wall now. 71, 71.1, 71.2. Admiral Byrd is here.
All of this done with the misguided help of the one and only Conspiracy Bot.
You're all idiots.
Hysteria 51 is a hilarious expedition into the eccentric.
Stop on my joke.
I
Thank
will when
you.
they're good.
Listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or your favorite podcatcher. Remember, the truth is out there, but you won't find it here.
Stay woke, meet sex.
What are you doing here? Don't you know Jerry and Tracy live here? No, it's too late. They're coming. They hear you. Ah, they're here.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 83 of Hillbilly Horror Stories. I'm Jerry, and I'm joined by my lovely wife, Tracy.
Hey, guys. Hope you had a great weekend.
And man, if you guys are into Bigfoot stories, this is not the episode for you because we're not talking anything about Bigfoot this
dang,
episode.
no Bigfoot. But we did buy a King Kong for my nephew today for a present, if that counts.
No, it doesn't.
Oh.
Of course, we want to start off by thanking all of our military and civil servants all around the world, no matter which country you represent or work for. Thank you guys and gals for everything that you do.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much.
Did you see the I showed you a video the other day. It was a lady who was trying to get man taken out of our dictionaries and out of our verbiage because she said that was discriminatory against women.
I will punch her in her face. All up in her face. Just please get a life. Jesus Pete. Ugh.
It was kind of funny to hear her explain it.
Whatever. She's whatever.
Which I do understand postman should be postal worker because there are women. And that part I understand. But she didn't even like the fact that man was in woman.
Well, it's been that way for a bazillion years, so you just need to get over yourself.
Well, there's a lot of things that's been that way for a bazillion years. It doesn't mean we don't change.
Well, that is just ridiculous. I swear, I wish she was in front of me.
Granted,
right now.
I think this one is ridiculous, but I don't think that's the reason to do it just because something's been that way forever.
I hope that they don't do that, because if they do that, then it's done. I'm just going to go live in a cave somewhere, eat chocolate, and drink wine.
Live in a cave.
I will.
You had problem when the electricity goes off and there's no internet for 15 minutes.
Well, that's beside the point. I'll make it work.
Anyways, let's jump real quick into our iTunes reviews, and then we'll tell you about the story we got going on. Tracy, would you like to read the iTunes reviews?
Oh, I knew you was going to have me do that. I would love to. Okay, this first one, I'm sure that I'm not going to get it right. It's Cassinars. See, I'm going to spell it, honey, because I didn't want to mess it up. CASS, stop laughing at me, Jerry. NASR. Thank you so much for your review. Pinup Girl, Shaggy from Paranormal Guys, Sid 1313, Stone Ubert, Joho 125, exclamation point, and Kate N. M. Kate. You guys, I love y'all. Y'all give me such nice reviews. We appreciate everything you say. We just love you. And we had some Patreon subscribers. Chris Savoy, 74, Buddy Kuchta. I hope I said that right. And Jen Woods. You guys rock. Thank you so much. We appreciate you guys more than you'll ever know. And again, I hope y'all keep those reviews coming because it gives me something to look at while I'm at work.
And Jen Woods, she jumped in with both feet because not only did she become a supporter, she's already been on our Patreon Listener Stories episode. So if you're a subscriber to that and you've heard the March version of Listener Stories, you've heard Jen on there already.
Yes, we were really glad to have her, and she did a great job.
And we had several problems with an entity not allowing her to do the
entity was rude.
Yeah, so if you're not a Patreon subscriber, you didn't get to hear this. So Jen calls to tell us her story. Her and her mom are both certified parapsychologists, and they've got a connection, we'll say. They kind of know what's going on with each other. They've just got that, extra intuition. And Jen's telling me the story about an entity in her house that her and her mom had both seen that probably is a little more on the evil side. Ew. About 3 minutes into it, as soon as she starts talking about it, it just cuts off recording. The phone call cuts off, and she's just talking away on her end, not realizing that we're not on there and we're not recording.
I hate when that happens.
I tried to call her, it wouldn't go through. And this was like on Facebook Messenger, so it's not like a regular, getting a busy signal. And we finally got a hold of each other. We talk. We get off the subject. We're talking about something else. As soon as I bring up the fact that the phone cut off, guess what happens?
Yep, again.
Phone cut off again. So she had another story that actually tied into Grant Wilson because she'd done some stuff with the ghost hunters on a little, I think a Civil War fort and a house that they did an investigation on with the ghost hunters. And I wanted her to tell that story since we just had Grant Wilson on. I thought it'd be a good tie-in. And there were so many difficulties. We're like, hey, maybe we'll just shoot for doing this tomorrow night. And she actually drove to her mom's house, away from her house where this so-called entity is, just to be able to make sure that we got the interview. And then we had no problems at all whatsoever.
I know, that's
that
so
night.
Crazy. It was
so,
funny.
yeah, I've never had so much trouble trying to get one conversation done. And, we did other interviews that night and really had no issues.
Right.
So.
Yeah, it was really crazy. But, man, I hate that when you're just talking up a storm and then you're like, oh.
Yeah, it was
it's like your air goes out of your balloon.
And when we called her, she was like, I'd already finished the story and everything before I realized you wasn't even on there. And we were only like 3 minutes in.
Oh, my gosh.
Of like a 15-minute story. So, well, I kind of teased you a little bit by saying there was no Bigfoot on this story. And I wasn't kidding. There is no Bigfoot on this story.
No.
We are going to have some Bigfoot or Dogman. We got a bunch of stuff working. We're trying to branch out and make everybody happy. And we know that some of you out there are really into cryptids, so we're going to work on some of that stuff. And we've actually got a lot of experts that are kind of local to us. I know there's some Dogman groups that are in Ohio that cover a lot of Kentucky and Ohio and Michigan stuff. And then we met some people, Steve Coles from what's that network? Destination America. It's really bad that I should know that thing, but he's with. Same group that Jack Kenna's with, and he's literally a Bigfoot expert, and he's a wealth of knowledge. Had fun talking with him. I'm going to get him on, so that'll cover a lot of our cryptid stuff. UFOs. We get people ask us all the time about UFOs. We know my thoughts on UFOs. I'm not all that excited about it, so it takes a unique story for me to do it. But what we have on tonight's show is actually about the Aztec UFO incident, which to me is more UFO / cover-up related conspiracy theory type stuff than it is just UFO crash. That's the part that I really like about this story.
Okay.
Also on tonight's show, we have Kristofferson on the show. He wrote Me and Bobby McGee.
Stop.
Well, who's on the show then?
It's not Kristofferson. I mean, is he dead?
Well, I hope not. I just did an interview with him. But he's going to be sad to find that out.
Oh, I think he did die, though.
I don't think Kristofferson is dead.
Oh, you don't think? I thought he did.
No.
I like him.
Well, who's the interview with?
Rob Kristofferson. Oh, my gosh. I cannot say that word.
Well, who the hell's he?
Rob Kristofferson. Oh, my gosh. What can I say his name?
I don't know, but I'm highly disappointed now. So what does he do?
He came on your show.
We're just playing with Rob.
Yeah, we're just playing.
Rob is actually, he's got a show out, and we actually heard him because we played the promo for it a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
It's called Our Strange Skies, and we talked about him a lot, I think, on last week's show. Awesome show. He breaks down UFO stuff without going, too much into just the details of a story,
Right.
like we're going to do tonight. He just basically breaks a lot of stuff down and makes the average person who may not know a lot of this stuff feel like they are really onto the know, because he breaks it all down to
He
where
sure does.
anybody can understand it.
Yeah,
So
he really does.
that's
So
all. But he came on the show, fantastic interview, and like I said, I like giving him some crap, but it's definitely Rob Kristofferson. It's
I'm gonna practice that name.
Your YER UFO guy on
Right.
Twitter.
Yeah, it's very interesting what he had to say. So,
Have you listened to the interview?
stop it. Yes, I have.
Okay, so let's jump right into here and mention that Our Strange Skies is actually part of the Dark Myths Collective, which a lot of great shows you could check out. Another of which is Hysteria 51, which you heard the promo for earlier. Now, before we get into tonight's show, we actually do have a sponsor for this show, so let's hear a little bit from Black Buffalo. Look, I found this absolutely fascinating, and the reason I did this story is because when I got through talking to Rob, I was like, hey, I'd really like to do a UFO story that most people won't know about. Everybody knows Roswell. This is actually really close to Roswell, time and location-wise. And he said, hey, he threw a couple suggestions out, and then at the end he was like, hey, have you ever heard of the Aztec UFO crash? And I'm like, no, never heard of it. He said, dig into it. I think you'll find it fascinating. And I can tell you this, for somebody who's not really that big on UFO stuff, I probably went down more rabbit holes with this story than any story we've ever looked into.
How come I didn't get to go down a rabbit hole?
Well, because, rabbit holes are built for one, and that would have been two. So
Well,
I don't know.
You always leave me out.
I don't know
of
if you
fun
know the
stuff.
rules of rabbit holes.
I don't.
And plus, you don't like carrots or
I
celery.
don't.
And you got to like celery to go down a rabbit hole.
Okay.
I don't know. I think it's state law. Anyways, so Rob tells me this story, and I sent Rob a message on Twitter later in the week. I'm like, basically, damn you, because I spent so much time looking at all these things, and I really didn't know where to start. There's so many different angles on this thing that if we ever did a show that would have been 2 parts, it would have been this one.
Oh.
But I'm not going to do that. I decided to, I guess, Reader's Digest compress it.
Yeah.
And try to get it all in there. So I think you'll get the gist of it. I could really be really boring with this by going into a lot of details, and I'm going to try not to do that. So that was my goal, is let me give you enough details without going too far in depth, because this thing was like follow the bouncing ball.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And it's so many twists and turns, and that's what makes the whole thing exciting. So let's jump into this thing. So supposedly this happened on March 25th, 1948. 8 months after the Roswell crash. Now, everybody knows about Roswell.
Oh, yeah.
So the story is, and I'm going to just be really brief with this, and then we're going to get into details. But the story is that there were 3 different radar units that were set up at 3 different locations in New Mexico. One of them actually had this abnormally strong radar, which radars are all microwaves. So you could just think about what microwaves do to your food, so you'd know what this will do. But all these radars are basically made of microwaves. One of them was super strong, and it had some type of effect, I guess, on a UFO that was coming by, and it kind of maybe knocked out the central control system, and this thing immediately went haywire, making the flying object go out of control. It crashes on the mesa right there in Aztec, New Mexico. There were 16 bodies found on board.
Aliens?
Aliens. Well, I mean, I doubt that they would have been, Californians or, it's.
Oh my God, how exciting.
So, all the rest of the story, though, is absolutely fascinating. And I can tell you that after hours of research on this thing, I'm still kind of on the fence as to what I believe about it. And I wouldn't have thought that as much research as I did, I wouldn't have at least picked a side. But
Did all the aliens die?
Can we get into the story?
Yeah.
But yes, they were all dead.
Aw. Yeah, let's get in.
So the first thing was, I had to figure out, was this a hoax?
Mm-hmm.
Because for years, that was the thought. It was a hoax. Is it possible it was just a huge cover-up? Well, that's the other side of the fence to be on. So I'll tell you what I know, and then I'm going to let you make your own decisions. This story can be very confusing depending on what side you choose to view it from. So let's cover the hoax side first. Frank Scully, which I think that's, if I'm going to guess on this, I don't know, but the X-Files was Scully and Mulder. I'm pretty sure they probably came up with her name based on this guy.
Oh, I was like, why does that name sound familiar?
Too much of a coincidence. Okay. But Frank Scully was a very famous writer at this time. He was an accomplished writer. He wrote for Variety, which was, I guess, a newspaper at the time. He eventually wrote a book in 1950 that had 4 UFO crash stories in it called Behind the Flying Saucers. Many considered these stories fiction and based loosely on eyewitness accounts. But most people just assumed he's full of crap. So here's the story. According to Scully's informants, this silver disc actually landed on the mesa and was basically just under 100 feet, which I think is funny because it was 99.99 feet. And if you're listening outside the United States, that's about 30.5 meters.
How are you going to act like you know what meters are?
I looked it up.
Oh, well, I was going to say, you did not know that. Go ahead.
It was made of a light metal that kind of resembled aluminum. And it was so durable, though, that no amount of heat would actually damage it.
Oh, wow.
They used up to 10,000 degrees, which is 5,500 Celsius.
Good job, babe.
To this thing, no kind of damage was done. They even tried to drill it with a diamond-tipped drill bit, but it had no effect on it. And if you're in a foreign country, it's a diamond-tipped drill bit. Sorry, force of habit. So it had these.
My teeth hurt.
It had these large metal rings on the inside of it that revolved around like a central stabilized cabin, and it had this very unfamiliar gear ratio to what anybody had seen. So this is how the thing flew. It was this thing and these rings inside, like a magnetic type situation, would spin, and somehow or another that was like the motor to the thing.
Oh, that's so crazy.
There were no rivets, there were no bolts, no screws, no sign of welding. This was one continuous piece of metal as it looked from the outside.
Oh, gosh.
So the only damage that they could see was like there was a crack on one of the portholes. So think like a ship, like a cruise ship with the holes for the windows. So there was a porthole. But after making this crack that they seen, after kind of making it a little bit bigger, they could look into it and see there was a knob on the inside. So they had a pole, they inserted it into the hole and pushed the knob. This caused a hidden door to open up. They found 16 small humanoid bodies inside the aircraft. They ranged in height from 36 to 42 inches. That's 91 to 106 centimeters.
They were a little bitty.
They were. They were dead bodies, and they were all burned to a dark brown color.
Oh.
So Scully was actually told that the aircraft was undamaged primarily because it landed under its own control. So this was not like a crash. This was like a soft landing.
So nothing like on the inside was?
No, there was no damage to the inside whatsoever. So this is where, once again, the microwave thing maybe comes in, which, I don't know.
So you think that's what killed the aliens then?
Well, I don't see... From this side of the story, I don't see what else it could have been.
Yeah, okay.
You know, or maybe the fracture caused some kind of air inside, and I don't know. No idea whatsoever on that part. So investigators actually discovered that it was manufactured in segments. Once they actually started digging into it, they had these little grooves that the segments fit into grooves, and then underneath it, the base, they were all kind of pinned together. So they completely dismantled this disc. The complete cabin, which they said it measured 18 feet in diameter, and that's about 5.5 meters. They lifted it out of the saucer. There was a gear around the cabin which fit into a gear that was on the ship. So that's where the gear that for the functions and stuff was on the outside, so that could spin around without the cabin spinning around. All the segments and the bodies were transported to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is in Dayton, Ohio. You're close to where our live show will be.
What?
Where our boys from Ohio are.
Nice.
Some of the bodies were later examined by the Air Force, who said that they were similar to humans, with the exception, get this, you're going to like this, as their teeth were pretty much perfect.
See?
Why is this considered a hoax? Well, Scully admits that the bulk of his information for this book came from two sources. Silas Newton and a Dr. G, we'll call him. And we're going to get way more into this stuff a little more. This is just the basics of the story. Now, Silas Newton is described in a 1941 FBI report as a wholly unethical businessman. Dr. G, which I said we would get into, is the name given to supposedly 8 different scientists. It was like a collective name. So he called him Dr. G, but it was really 8 scientists. But to protect their names, he just used that. All of whom gave various details to Newton and Scully. So these scientists all supposedly had been there. They give the information to Silas and Newton, and he writes the book about it. Now, most say that Dr. G was not 8 scientists, but a man by the name of Leo Gebauer, who was about as unethical as Silas Newton, according to everybody else. So,
crime, huh?
Right. So during the late 40s and early 50s, Silas and Leo actually traveled through Aztec, attempting to sell these devices known as doodle bugs.
Okay.
Which that sounds, nice and professional.
Well, that sounds cute, though.
Well, these devices supposedly used alien technology to locate oil, gas, and gold. So supposedly the technology came from the information from these scientists, so they used these to make these devices. Now, they were selling these detector type devices for $18,500, but unfortunately, you could buy these same devices in like a surplus store for $3.50.
Oh my gosh.
So this alien technology came from the crash in Aztec, supposedly. Now, J.P. Kahn, who's a writer for the San Francisco Chronicle at the time, he asked for a piece of the metal so he could research it, and he determined that it was just an ordinary piece of aluminum. Or if you're in England, aluminium.
Aluminium?
In 1949, Scully started publishing a whole bunch of different columns with these stories on the crash of Aztec as told by Silas and Leo. He later used these columns to decide to write his book, Behind the Flying Saucers. Now, Kahn exposed this as a hoax in 1952 and 1953 with 2 articles that he wrote from True Magazine. And we're going to get into a little more about Kahn and his involvement in this. He even went as far as to write J. Edgar Hoover a letter about all this before he wrote his articles, and J. Edgar Hoover was head of the FBI. So he wanted to make sure that this was out there. So one of the people, and did I mention, I might have jumped place, but he wrote these 2 articles in True Magazine, is where he wrote them to expose them. Now, one of the people that was duped in this whole thing by buying one of these, what they call tuners, doodle bugs, was a guy by the name of Herman Flater. He was a millionaire from Denver, and he pressed charges, and Silas and Leo were actually convicted of fraud-related charges. So then, after that, everybody called the case a hoax. So we see what's going on. Let's rehash this a little bit. So this guy writes a book. He tells about the crash. He was told about the crash from these 2 guys and supposedly 8 scientists, but most people think it was just these 2 guys. And these guys were trying to sell stuff that they said was made from alien technology to help you find oil and stuff, and was making a fortune off of it. So how credible were these guys? Plus, these guys already had a rap sheet for going back and duping people for even years before that.
What?
So
I guess nobody knew that?
I guess some people did, but it's not like they had the internet to look stuff up. We're talking about 1948 to 50.
That's very true.
So it just makes sense that there's no reason to believe any of this because the 2 guys that were behind the story, and at this point, everything we had was based on these 2 guys. They were con men that were duping people, and it was all hinged on the fact of them saying they had this alien technology. Yeah. So it would make sense that since their doodle bugs were fake to begin with to most people, then obviously they were just lying.
Well, they should have pulled out one of those little alien dudes and said, see?
Well, they didn't have one of the alien dudes. They were selling doodle bugs, not alien dudes.
Oh.
So there we go. Problem solved. It's a hoax.
Fraud is not good, is what you're trying to say.
It's not necessarily true, though, that this was a hoax. Because, first of all, we talked about Khan actually writing the articles to disprove this and expose them as a hoax. But there's a lot of people that actually say that he was pissed off because he wanted the story and wanted to run it in the San Francisco Chronicle.
Yeah.
They chose to turn around and give it to Scully, who then wrote a book about it. So they think that maybe just because of a case of sour grapes, basically, he turned around and wrote these articles exposing them. So the story actually stayed dormant for years, but in 1986, so keep in mind, this was like 1953 when it was exposed as a hoax. So you're basically looking at 33 years later in 1986, a guy named William Steinman and Wendell Stevens, they actually wrote a book called UFO Crash in Aztec. In 1998, Linda Mouton Howe, who actually, she's a UFO expert, and she was also a regular on Art Bell's shows that we've talked about, Coast to Coast, on here so long. She'd been on there. And she actually said that she had government documents that proved the Aztec crash. So now, 30-some years later, this thing is starting to grow legs with the book that Steinman and Stevens wrote, and with Mouton Howe actually coming on and saying we got stuff. So the years have passed, more and more evidence has actually come out to suggest that maybe there is a lot more truth to the story than many thought originally. And that's where we're going to pick up.
And I know this is dumb to say, but isn't it weird that just people will pick up something that happened 30 years ago? Most people are just like...
Well, and that's the whole thing. And that's what people would hope, is sometimes these things just...
die down and nobody brings it up again.
So let's go back a little bit and start talking about what has come up since then that leads people to believe that maybe this was a giant cover-up. So in 1974, there was a professor by the name of John Spencer Carr. Now, part of this evidence included testimony from a senior U.S. Air Force officer that was supposedly involved in the UFO retrieval.
Mm-hmm.
The FBI was definitely interested in what Silas Newton actually had to say about the whole incident, especially considering that they deemed it to be a hoax. On March 8, 1950, Newton did a lecture at the Denver University. Now, he was actually billed there as Scientist X, not as Silas Newton. The lecture was actually attended by the FBI, or at least monitored by the FBI, because they released an urgent teletype on March 9th from the Denver FBI office.
Whoa.
So it just kind of lets you believe that maybe there was more to it.
Yeah.
So why are they monitoring what he has to say about it?
Exactly.
So here's what the actual teletype said. 2 sources advise that Silas Newton has given at least 1 and possible more lectures before classes at Denver University yesterday or today, in which he discussed flying saucers, which he allegedly observed. The person claimed to have seen several objects, of which landed in New Mexico. He also claimed to observe occupants of the saucers, described by him as humanoids, but around 3 feet tall. Now, Newton had actually been escorted to this lecture by a staff member of the Rocky Mountain radio station named George Kaler. Within 2 hours of this talk, U.S. intelligence officers were already asking Kaler questions about the lecture and what his opinions were of it. Kaler recorded these interrogations, basically, and then at the end of these interviews, he was told, hey, we know that you recorded these, so we need you to hand the tapes over. It's an awful lot to go on for something that's a hoax.
I know. What the heck? But you know what? I mean, seriously, they're 3 feet tall. What are they going to do to you?
Why are you focusing on that?
I don't know.
That has nothing to do with anything. And you're like 4'11".
I know. I feel tall. I could overcome them. Sorry.
So soon after this whole thing, a Kansas City car dealer by the name of Rudy Flick, he started telling stories. But Kaler supposedly crashed the gates at one of these radar stations near the New Mexico and Arizona border, and he had seen 2 flying saucers that the military actually had in their possession. He said one was badly damaged, and the other one was virtually intact. Once again, the FBI stepped in. And this is from that FBI teletype. According to the info given to Kaler, around 50 of these flying saucers have been found in the U.S. over a period of 2 years. Of these, 40 are in the U.S. Research Center in Los Angeles. Each craft had a crew of 3 people on the 2 that were in question, that he said he saw. The bodies in the damaged ship were actually charred, and the aliens that were in the ship that was in pretty much perfect condition, they were in a perfect state and of preservation, but they were still dead. So that was the situation with them. All were uniform height of 3 feet, beardless, and their teeth were free of any fillings or cavities. They wore no undergarments, but their bodies were taped, and they were dressed in some sort of a wire. So I guess whatever their uniform or something was made out of wires.
Mm-hmm.
So Mr. Fick feels that the security department of the military feared that the sudden shock of a surprise announcement from the about this interplanetary travel possibly could cause mass hysteria. So the OSI District 13 will interview Flick. The editor of the Kansas City Star stated that he was well aware of the story that was going around, but they don't dare publish this in the paper because it was way too fantastic.
Oh.
So this comes straight from an FBI teletype.
Oh my gosh. There's so much we don't know. This is so crazy.
Now, there's a partly censored FBI document on March 22nd, 1950 that shows a story very similar to Fick's circulating in Washington, D.C. So that means more than one person actually was reporting these same things over and over, which makes it more likely that something was going on. Now, some other evidence that can be attributed to William Steinman in 1987, we talked about his book a little bit earlier. He claims that when the crash happened, that the info was immediately sent over to the Air Defense Commander and General George C. Marshall, who was then the Secretary of State. They then contacted the MJ-12 group, that was a military group, as well as the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit of the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Directorate. The IPU worked out of Camp Hell in Colorado. Supposedly, the IPU, which is the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, their main function was to deliver disabled or crashed disk to a secret location.
Oh, wow.
So the craft was actually recovered within hours by the IPU scout team 12 miles northeast of Aztec. General Marshall ordered air defense to go off alert, and he basically said that the radar units had advised that they had a false alarm.
No way.
Yeah.
They did not.
Yeah. So Marshall then gave the order to commence, or for the IPU to organize a recovery team, and contacted a Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was the head of the MJ-12, to gather a team of scientists and to accompany the IPU to the crash site. He went on to name all of the scientists, which I'm not going to name here, but there was a bunch of scientists strictly by name. 4 of them were actually members of the original MJ-12 that was set up in 1947, which, keep in mind, was just a year before this crash. Dr. Carl Hyland was a geophysicist and a magnetic science expert, and he is one of the supposedly scientists that leaked the details of the recovery to Leo Jabauer. So we talked earlier about they had this. So now what we're starting to find out is that maybe this Leo Jabauer and Silas weren't really as full of crap as they made it to be, and they were actually being leaked this information. So, but we're going to get into a little more of that, of how much was actually true, that we find out as we move on to the story. But the IPU used a route to the crash site to avoid the main road, so they kind of took some back roads because they didn't want to be seen. Roadblocks were set up at strategic points around 2 miles of the recovery area, and the owner of the ranch and his family were told never to speak of this matter.
Oh, my Lord.
Equipment hauling trucks were camouflaged to look like oil drilling rigs during this operation, and the scientists arrived later than the IPU team and began dissecting the disk. They entered into the craft one by one, the same way that was explained earlier, according to Scully's book. The portholes themselves appeared to be metallic and only appeared translucent when you actually got really close to them, that you could see that they were kind of see-through.
Oh, that's so cool.
So they did everything the way they said. There was a crack. They made it bigger. They used the pole, just like was in Scully's book. Once inside, they found 2 humanoids that are about 2 feet in height. They were slumped over the instrument panel, charred, but no sign of fire inside the cabin. Another 12 bodies were sprawled all around the floor of the cabin. So the only difference here is, according to this story, there was 14, not 16, which was in Scully's book. The instrument panel had several push buttons and levers and hieroglyphic type symbols on it. There was a drawer that actually pulled out, but there were no wires, visible wires, that could be seen. They found a book that was like a parchment type leaves with textures of plastic that also had hieroglyphics on them, similar to Sanskrit.
Oh, that's weird.
Yep. They put bodies on dry ice. They dismantled the ship in 3 pieces, loaded it on 3 different trucks with the bodies, and put a tarp over them and marked it as explosive. The convoy headed by night by the least conspicuous route to a restricted naval auxiliary airfield complex at Los Alamos, arriving at 1 week after they picked them up. So it took them a week to get there. The bodies were actually here for a year, and then they were transported to another undisclosed base. Dr. Paul Shearer eventually obtained special preservation containers for the least damaged bodies. The companies which actually supplied the equipment was the Air Research Corporation. It supplied the liquid nitrogen pump, circulation system, and refrigeration units. Sure is an awful lot of details for something that was a hoax. So the other bodies were given a complete autopsy by a team handled by Dr. Bronk of biophysicists. The results were actually put into a force named the Air Force Project Sign Report number 13, which has never actually been released. So this was not one that's been declassified as of yet. The bodies averaged, according to the autopsy, 42 inch in length and facial features resembling Mongolian Orientals with disproportionately large heads, large slant eyes, small noses and mouths. Average weight was 40 pounds. Torsos were small, thin, with very thin necks. Their arms were long and slender and reached their knees. Their hands had very long and slender fingers with webbing in between them. They had no digestive or gastrointestinal tract, no intestinal canal, and no rectal point. That will disappoint Nick from Brohio.
Yes, they will.
No reproductive organs were apparent. There was no blood, but there was a colorless liquid with no red cells, and it smelled similar to ozone.
Oh my gosh.
Now, that's all coming from his book. More recently, Scott and Suzanne Ramsey have actually released a few books and working on a third, the first being the Aztec UFO incident. Scott has researched this craft since 1987 and is the foremost researcher in the whole Aztec incident. Him and his wife know everything and anything. Now, what took their stuff to the different level than the books that we talked about earlier is they actually talked to a lot of people involved. They've done so much research. When you talk about over 30 years of research, basically.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And Suzanne's family had moved from her mom and dad, I think they lived, I can't remember exactly, I'm going off memory, but I want to say they lived up in the north. And her mom read this book by Scully, like in the 60s, and decided that this was sound like a really cool place to live. So they moved to Aztec because of this.
No, what?
Yeah, so they moved out there. They just want to, but then they found out it just really wasn't all that fascinating when they got there because nobody was willing to talk about it.
Right.
Now, somewhere down the line, there was a convention out there, and Scott was part of the convention, and they had one of these little, like where you buy a ticket and you get a chance to win a lunch with somebody. And she bought a ticket to win lunch with Scott. She actually won. And then they went to lunch and discussed stuff, and then 8 months later, they actually got married.
Oh, my gosh.
So that's
funny?
That's how she came to be part of this. So he was already researching it. Her family moved there because of it. She was already fascinated.
So it was kind of meant to be.
Yeah, it's kind of meant to be. And so, like I said, they started researching together, and they've uncovered many different eyewitnesses that have since passed away, unfortunately. We're going to talk about some of them. So in the book, and the interviews that they do, it makes me kind of lean towards this actually happening, as opposed to before where I was thinking, yeah, it definitely sounds like a hoax. But now I'm kind of thinking, and you'll hear why I'm kind of getting that way. It just seems like there's a lot of stuff that all ties in the same stuff that everybody else was finding.
Well, how did Scott get everybody to talk is what I want to know.
Well, I don't think that he got everybody to talk. There was just a lot of people who weren't in the area anymore, and he's just done. Well, let me get into it, and I think it'll answer some of your questions.
Okay.
So the Ramseys were actually able to talk to a lot of very credible witnesses, including those who were in the military. And part of how they did this is they've spent, according to Scott Ramsey, they've spent probably close to $500,000 of their own money and several 100,000 hours just trying to get these military reports declassified so that they could get their hands on them. So that's going to be part of how they were getting people to talk to them, because they had this stuff in their hands. They were also able to find the 3 radar bases, which we were told didn't exist. They literally took maps and said, hey, where would we place it at? And went out and searched the desert and found them.
What?
Yep. They found, and they actually, like one of them actually had paperwork. This is going to fit into what we were talking about earlier. One of them still had paperwork in it talking about how strong the radar was, and it even had a warning to not be using it if there were aircraft in the area.
Oh, wow. I'm surprised those 2 didn't go missing.
Right. So you can see how that fits into the theory of what people have been saying earlier about it got basically knocked out of the sky because of the strong air, wave that was being shot at, this radar wave. And yet here's something written from the military in there basically saying this could cause problems with aircraft in the area. And why else would you have a radar? I mean, radar typically is to detect something. Why would you have something that's so strong that it could possibly disable an aircraft, knock it out of the sky?
Yeah.
And they've talked to people in the midst, and I didn't write this in the notes, but they've talked to people that back during World War II, they had a similar type setup that was able to knock out 17 Japanese subs.
Oh my gosh!
That were using this same technology in something like a day. One day, knocked out like 17
insane.
subs.
So they never had an incident then where it did knock a plane down or anything. Because if not, they're pretty lucky.
No, apparently not, unless you count this, because that's what everybody seems to think happened here. So we got that part of it. There's a retired Air Force officer, and they can't use his name until he's passed away, because that's just the way the military works. But they told him what the situation was, and they wanted to meet with him because they knew he had some information. Now, this guy had never told his story to anybody except for his wife, and right before she passed away. He kept a tight lip on what he knew about this situation.
Wait a minute, he told his wife?
Yeah, he told his wife right before she passed away. That's the only person he ever told the story that he
was
told
probably
the
like,
Ramseys. Yeah.
What a relief to tell it.
So, obviously, like I said, can't use the name, but they met him at a Radisson, and they showed him some declassified information. So he felt like he could, okay, you've got some of the information, let me expound on it. He told them that there were over 200 people that were involved in the cleanup, gathering all the information, or gathering all this stuff from the craft and everything. Now, he wasn't actually at the site himself, but he had to write a whole bunch of reports on people who were there. So he felt like he was there by how much information he knew on it. He said that they had to cut a road that didn't exist back to the aircraft. And that road is still there today, but that road subsequently isn't on any maps.
Oh, gosh.
So here we are 50-some years later.
And
it's still not on any maps. He said, hey, if you think you got the right place, look for a concrete slab, because they needed a crane to pick up the parts and haul it, and everything back there is silt, which is like a really soft sand.
Oh, so they would sink and stuff.
And he said they needed something stable to put this crane on, so they had to build a concrete slab, basically, to put this crane on.
Oh, man.
Well, he didn't know that at the time that the Ramseys had already been out there several times, so they knew exactly what he was talking about. And this slab just sits in the middle of nowhere. In the middle of a desert, there's just a concrete slab that serves no purpose. Now, most people, when you ask them, they'll tell you that it's like a cap out there for the gas and oil and stuff like that. they know that's not the case because it doesn't make sense. It wouldn't be out there. That's not what they would use.
Yeah. But to anybody else, we probably would be,
right.
Okay.
For us, I mean, we don't know any different.
Right.
He said they've actually, it would be dangerous to drill a hole in it if that's what it actually was because of buildup. But he said they've actually drilled into it. Wasn't afraid because they knew that was a BS story. They've had it analyzed. That's not what it is.
Oh my
so there's no reason in the world for that to be out there. Just like there's no reason for that road to be there. That guess where it just happens to end at?
Oh.
Right where the crash site was.
Oh my.
So anyway, so he tells them about this, and they thought that was fascinating because a lot of what he was telling them was stuff they already knew without divulging that information. So let's start talking about Ken Farley. Ken Farley is another credible witness that they were able to catch up with. Ken was 20 years old at the time. He was traveling from Durango, Colorado to San Diego. He had a friend in Aztec, so he had stopped off in Aztec at the time. Now, Ken wasn't from the area, so he didn't really know anybody. But his friend actually told him that there was something going on Hart Canyon Road where this took place, and they should go check it out because obviously there's not a lot of excitement going on.
Yeah.
For people who don't know, Roswell, this place, several other places in New Mexico. New Mexico is a really big state, but it's not densely populated. So for the amount of people there, there's a lot of room.
There's a lot of empty
There's
space.
a lot of empty space, a lot of desert area where there's, just a lot of land to roam, basically, where, that's why they did all the, for people who don't know, most of our nuclear testing, if not all of it, is pretty much done in New Mexico.
Yeah.
Because they don't have to worry about the population of people and doing the damage. And that's why a lot of people think, why Roswell? Why this place? Why 8 months apart? Why is there supposedly all these other UFO crashes in New Mexico? I guess if you think about it, we've done all these nuclear explosions and everything there, so there should be a lot of radioactivity in air. I guess if you were a UFO or a group of people, different species from outer space, you would maybe go where you see radiation or something like that. There might, if that's what makes your, civilizations tick or something like that.
Yeah, it's going to draw them there.
Yeah, so maybe that's why they were drawn there is because of all the radioactivity that was in there.
That makes sense.
So anyway, so this guy's friend says, hey, there's a lot of stuff going on down Hart Canyon Road. Let's go check it out. So let's fast forward to the year 2000. Scott and Randy Barnes actually interviewed Ken in Phoenix, Arizona. Okay, so this is about an hour away from where Ken actually lived, but he drove up there. Now, it's important to note that Ken was actually dying of cancer at this time.
Aww.
So he was kind of on his deathbed. As a matter of fact, he died almost 2 years to the day of this interview.
No way.
That he actually did. So the story went pretty much the way that they've known the story to be. So now you got this witness that's lining up everything that you've already pretty much heard.
Yeah.
But this guy was supposedly at the crash site. Now, he said at the crash site there were 2 police officers. Now, this was the only thing that Ramsey was kind of skeptical of because he knows that he had never heard anybody else mention there being 2 police officers out there. So this kind of stood out as, oh, well, maybe he's just making something up or maybe he don't remember correctly. And keep in mind, this is a very remote place with a very small police force. So chances are, he said, if you went out to there today and called 911, the chances of more than 1 police officer showing up would be very strange. So for there to be 2 show up back in 1948 would have been extremely odd. So he decides, look, we'll kind of put this on the back burner. We've got the story, but let's see what shakes out as we move forward. So then they get an interview with a gentleman by the name of Doug Nolan. Now, Doug actually worked for El Paso Oil Company at the time. He was 19 years old, and he actually died 2 months after doing this interview.
No.
But he had, had 6 strokes and was on his,
Oh, gosh.
he was really suffering. Keep in mind, these guys were all 70s, 80s, years old at the time, even though they were 20 back in 1948. By the time they catch up with him in I think this was 2003 when he did this interview. I do the math on it, but I know he's up there in age. And somebody who's had 6, 7 strokes.
Yeah.
So anyway, so Doug's boss had called him that morning, Bill Ferguson, and he told him that there was a brush fire out on Hart Canyon Road, and they needed to get out there because the company had some drip tanks out there, which I'm not exactly sure what a drip tank is, but obviously it's got something to do with oil.
Yeah, so they didn't want it to
they wanted to make sure that they got it taken care of. So they get out there, and they find out that the fire wasn't even near the drip tanks. It was up on the ridge. But some other workers came down and said, hey, the fire's under control, but you guys really need to see what's laying out there on the western edge of the mesa. So Doug, like I said, he had 6 strokes and was telling his story extremely slow, but he seemed to be mentally, he was 100% there. He was just slow in his delivery, but he knew what he was talking about. Well, now what he says makes Ken Farley's interview kind of start to make sense, because Doug also said there were 2 police officers there.
Oh.
So now they got 2 people
that said
who
that.
didn't really know each other.
Yeah.
Because remember, the one Ken Farley wasn't from the area. But there might be a sign here of him being seen by Doug, because Doug said that he pretty much named all of the locals that were there, but he did say that there was a couple of people there on the outside that he didn't recognize. That very well could have been Ken Farley and his friend.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, they weren't from there, so that would make sense. But of the 2 police officers, he said one of them was from Cuba, New Mexico, and the other one was a local. So now they know, and they're in the process of still right now trying to figure out who this other officer was, because at the time, Cuba and New Mexico only had 2 sheriffs or 2 deputies there. So it's going to be one of the 2.
Yeah.
So they're in the process of trying to figure that out. There was also a local there, and they only had 3 police officers on the force there. So they're in the process of trying to figure that out. But now they got 2 different eyewitnesses who don't know each other saying there were 2 police officers, and this one that was actually able to tell you where they were from.
Oh.
So that's kind of an interesting twist on that. He also noticed that, there seemed to be some very well-dressed men there that almost looked out of place. And then when I hear that, it makes me think Men in Black type situation. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's a little bizarre.
So now we got Fred Reed, and Fred Reed passed away right after the interview, as per most of the other ones. But Fred, he was actually sent there to do cleanup. That's what he did. His job was to do cleanup type of stuff. But usually when they were sent out, it was for plane crashes. So that's what he assumed that it was. But later, Fred was actually told by a friend of his that the crash site was actually a flying disc that it crashed up there. So he's going by that. In 2000, he was contacted by the he actually contacted the Farmington Daily News and wrote a letter of what he remembered. So he was actually telling them basically the same thing everybody else is telling us of what they seen. So with all this being in, it looks like that Frank Scully's book was actually approximately about 85% correct. The one that was considered to be a hoax. Now, after talking to all these people, the Ramseys have talked to, Steinman's book where he talked to all these different people, him and Wendell, it really is starting to look like, with all these declassified articles and stuff that they were showing, that it looks a lot more like a cover-up than a hoax.
Well, I think it's amazing that all these people they interviewed, it's almost like what they've said, they've been holding in for years and years and years. And it's like after the interview, it's like, oh, thank God. I said what I needed to say.
You can kind of move on.
And you can move on and die. And that's terrible to say that, but that seems like a weird, that all those people have passed away right after their interviews. But that's very interesting, too, that what all has been found out.
Yeah, because, I mean, and if you listen to, there's a lot of stuff out there by the Ramseys on YouTube and other podcasts, and they're pretty fascinating in what they cover. I mean, we didn't touch the surface of the details they go into. I touched on the finer points. If you watch, there's a video out there of Scott Ramsey actually showing all these, some or at least some of these declassified documents and reading into it. It really looks a lot more like a cover-up than a hoax. So I think, even though I said I was on the fence in the beginning, I think I've pretty much talked myself into believing that this happened.
Yeah. I mean, it surely sounds like it. I don't know how these people do that, hold all that information in, or you can't leak it out, or you can't breathe a word. I mean, how do you live your life?
I don't know.
With all that information.
Well, it's like, and one of the things I remember hearing Scott Ramsey talk about, and this was one of the first things I actually watched on him, which was like earlier in the week. He was talking about that the people who were doing the cleanup, they were talking about comments like, we did a lot better job on this one than what we did in Roswell and stuff like that, because the Roswell deal, obviously it leaked out and there was articles in the paper about this was a crash, and then all of a sudden, it was a crash, then it was a weather balloon, and so then all the controversy, that's why you know so much about Roswell,
right?
Is because everything that came out, where nothing really came out about this one, and for people to be pretty much bragging that we did a heck of a lot better job.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, they just kind of maybe let it slip or something.
There's no doubt in my mind that there's aliens. There's no doubt that there's been several cover-ups by the government. I mean, we've covered the Rendlesham Forest, which I think is a prime example of so much evidence out there in the cover-up. You know, how much goes into it. I mean, do I believe they found all these bodies? Do I believe, they're holding these bodies at all these different Air Force bases and Area 51? I don't know to 100% what I believe the level is, but there's no doubt that they found down aircraft and have covered it up.
How do they keep those? I mean, I wonder if their bodies are different. How do they preserve them?
Oh, I'm sure just like anything else, probably cryogenically. So they're probably frozen.
That's so interesting. And it's the freakiest thing not to know what all actually goes on in this world that none of us have a clue about.
It's like I said, we talked about it before, and I think I talked about it in this interview coming up with Chris Kristofferson.
It's not Chris.
Rob Kristofferson. But Rob wrote Me and Bobby McGee, right? No, you know what? I wish I'd have done this interview with Rob after the fact, because I would really love to have had what he said about this situation, his beliefs and stuff, because we didn't cover that when he just gave me the idea, but he didn't tell me whether he believed, not believed, or what it was. But I would have loved to have talked to him about his thoughts. But we do talk about a bunch of other different situations that I think will fascinate you. So while we're on that subject, let's go ahead and listen to Rob Kristofferson from Our Strange Skies. All right, we got a fellow Dark Myths Collective podcaster on the line with us, Mr. Rob Kristofferson. I'm not going to say Chris. I'll say Rob Kristofferson, even though every time I go to say your name, it always comes out Chris. And Rob is host of Our Strange Skies, which is, in my opinion, the best UFO/alien, I guess, podcast out there, because I've made it clear on the show several times, Rob. I'm just really not usually that much into the whole space exploration or the possibility of aliens, or even the big stories, Roswell and Rendlesham Forest and all that. We've done some shows on them just because I know people like to hear about them. But I guess to me, I've just accepted the fact that they're all fact, that it's just not that big a deal to me. So what's your thoughts on, just in general, people that have my kind of attitude, or people who don't believe at all in UFOs?
I think one of the most amazing things about the phenomena itself is that, for one, when we talk about ghosts, we talk about Bigfoot, we talk about these weird esoteric experiences, we have boxes that they fit into, like, comfortably. Like, ghostly phenomena fits into a box. So does Bigfoot, whether, you have different theories on it or not. The UFO phenomena doesn't really fit into as neat a box as we'd like it to, because for one, we don't know what's causing it. We don't have a clue, and we have so many different hypotheses to try and expound upon it that it's really crazy, and it's one that requires a lot of open-mindedness too, and the thing is like, when you talk about like the ghost people don't get along with the UFO people, and they don't get along with the Bigfoot people, it's kind of a weird thing, because we're all in the same area, but it's for whatever reason, this topic is tough for people, and perhaps it's because this topic has largely been pushed by the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which is, hey, aliens exist, or at least that's what that narrative pushes. There are others, but I think people have a tough time with the thought of extraterrestrial life for whatever reason. And I think that, yeah.
I was going to say, I don't get that either, because I think you got to be pretty egotistical to think that we live in a universe as big as what this universe is, and to think that we're the only type of life out there other than, there's people out there that say, oh, I think there's life, but it's amoebas and parasites. And I just, to think that we're the only type of beings walking around, intelligent beings, I think is completely ludicrous. I guess that's why I'm not so fascinated with the subject, is because I just take it as a given that there's got to be other living beings like us out there.
Yeah, and that's the narrative that the hard sciences pushes, is like they believe in extraterrestrial life. They just don't believe that it's visited our planet. And I think that definitely pushes back against this idea that, well, hey, maybe aliens are flying these ships and they're coming into our atmosphere and showing themselves to us. But again, that also goes to the point that we really don't know what this is. Like, most people will jump to that conclusion that, oh, hey, these are aliens, but, well, maybe this is the government. Maybe the government's built this stuff, and these are all secret government tests, and there are plenty of conspiracies to deal with that end of it. And then you have people like John Keel, who in the 70s, the guy that wrote the Mothman prophecies, was putting out there that, hey, maybe these are interdimensional beings, and they're showing up and in these craft, but maybe they're not 100% a physical thing. Maybe some of it's a psychic kind of phenomenon. So you have a ton of competing hypotheses, and not one of them really agrees with the other. And yeah, that's the tough thing with this field, is that nobody can agree on anything, and a lot of people are closed-minded to other people's hypotheses.
Well, it's funny you mention that, because on the subject of what you just touched on, there are some people out there, and I talked about this with Steve Cole, the one of the Bigfoot experts from Destination America, and I thought he was going to flip on me. He got so irate about the concept that Bigfoot could be aliens. I'm sure you've heard that theory before. That's why they don't find any bones. That's why they don't find any of this. What's your theory on that? Do you think that there's anything at all to a possibility that Bigfoot or Mothman or these other cryptids that people see could be actually aliens?
Definitely possible. Earlier this year, Seth Breedlove of Small Town Monsters, he put out this great little short documentary called Invasion on Chestnut Ridge. And a lot of stuff has happened in that area, most famously the Kecksburg crash of 65, in which practically a whole town witnessed an acorn-shaped object just crash in the woods. And, of course, the government came in and took it, and, it was this whole thing about a government cover-up and everything. But one of the stories that was told in that documentary was about this farmer on his land, and he had seen some lights out in his field, and he goes and he sees like an object in the field, and coming out of the object are these really weird-looking Bigfoot. And they're almost not even walking. They seem to be like hovering. So there are definitely weird aspects that with people that have these sightings of Bigfoot that aren't always talked about. For instance, there are people that report that after having an encounter with Bigfoot, they'll see flashes of light in the sky, and like green flashes of light, and that never gets expounded upon. There are other phenomena like that associated with those, so it could be possible. I mean, when you think about Bigfoot too, there's like that camp that notices these things, whatever they are kind of built for the terrain, so maybe they are terrestrial. But then again, maybe they're not. It's tough to really say.
Way to take a stand there.
I know.
But you know, it's funny that you say that, because there are some places where there is all that phenomenon going on at one time. Like you said, Chestnut Ridge is a prime example, and that's an excellent documentary, by the way. And I can't remember the other documentary he did before that, but it was also very good. He does a really good job on what he does. He gets pretty in depth. But you know, then you look at Skinwalker Ranch, same situation out there, at least similar. I mean, where you've got, you know, Bigfoot, you got possible aliens and UFO sightings, and you got this and that, 1,000, you know, shapeshifters, everything going on in these certain locations where it just seems to breed paranormal phenomena. And, you know, so it does make you think that the possibility that something could be going on that ties all of it together to extraterrestrials, to me.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't hurt to be open to it. And that's the tough thing about this, is there's no 100% evidence to actually, you know, support that. But hey, there are these weird, odd things that pop up from time to time. Like, nobody can really explain those flashes of light. And I had a conversation with John E.L. Tenney about this, about how when certain things are covered, like Bigfoot sightings or like alien abductions, there are certain oddities that people fail to include because they either don't make sense or they don't have a place to fit them. Like, for instance, in some alien abductions, people talk about aliens wearing out-of-period American clothing, like modern abductions, and there's an alien wearing clothes from the 1700s. What's up with that?
Yeah, that's could be worse. Could be from the 1970s. And
oh God,
I can't imagine, if they are intelligent life, they're not wearing anything from the 70s. I couldn't imagine getting anal probed by somebody wearing some bell-bottom jeans and a Nehru jacket. But that's just me.
Understandable. I can totally understand. For me, it would be the 80s and those like flock of seagulls hairdos. I don't think I could. I don't think I could handle that.
Look, I got a couple of other situations that some people like to tie with alien abduction that I want to get your thoughts on. What about all these mysterious disappearances in state parks? Now, I understand, obviously, it's a state park. People are hiking. It's vast terrain. It's easy for people to get lost. But there's been a lot of people that just disappear and then show back up and have no recollection of where they've been. Sometimes they're naked. Sometimes they're, you know. What are your thoughts on how that ties together?
Well, the strange thing about the missing 411 kind of stuff is that you really don't have ties to the abduction phenomena, really, other than the fact that these people just go missing. There's never usually any correlated UFO sightings, and it's just so weird because they just disappear out of nowhere. Like, there are more connections to things like Bigfoot taking them than there are UFOs. But the parallels are there, and they're fascinating because it's just where do they go? And I've seen a lot of interesting theories coming out. People talking about, hey, maybe these people are walking into portals. Maybe, you know, there be like the early, when you read Dave Paulides' books, the early sightings, there are these weird encounters that these people have with shape-shifting creatures of some kind. So maybe they are extraterrestrial. Who knows? But yeah, that's the one odd thing about that phenomenon, is that there really is no UFO data that really comes in behind it.
I think in some cases it fits more into like time slippage. And that was brought up my next question. Do you feel like people who experience time slippage, is that more of a portal type situation to you, or do you think that's got something to do with an abduction and just being put back at a later time where, you'll see a lot of times with these abduction stories where we just disappeared and I think we were gone for 20 minutes and it turned out to be 7 hours, those type of situations. Do you think there's a tie into that?
Very possibly, because when you talk about time dilation and how people experience it, it's as if time itself is removed. And given how we experience time on this planet, it's very linear in fashion. You can actually just pretty much take chunks of time out, and it can make for some really strange and odd feelings and memories that you're going to have about it. So that correlated aspect is definitely fascinating, and it definitely connects there, so it definitely opens up that possibility that, hey, maybe there is that whole abduction aspect, that whole alien abduction aspect that plays a part in this. Are there other creatures that can somehow manipulate time? Not just extraterrestrials, maybe interdimensional. It's kind of a really fascinating aspect to the whole thing, because when you talk about the guys in Rendlesham, that is an actual documented case of time dilation, because they correlated it not only with the watches that they were wearing, but also when they came out, they were about to go in, because they were supposedly in there for 2 hours on that first night, Peniston and Burroughs, and they only thought that I think like 20 minutes had gone by. So that is definitely one fascinating aspect to it, is like these craft, and sometimes when people interact with them, how are they able to slow time down? That's a strange thing.
Well, see, that's the kind of things that I love about your show, is because the type of stuff that we're talking about are the things you cover in the show. So like I said, it's not always specific to, let's just talk about this one case. It's occurrences and how these occurrences have affected people in general, not just specifically. Before we get too far in, because we're going to talk about a bunch of other stuff, tell people about your show, how they can find your show, and what you hope to accomplish with it. When you set out and said, hey, I'm going to do a podcast on this, what was your vision on putting out?
For me, because I started with paranormal investigations about 10 years ago, I headed in that direction, and I kind of made it to a spot where I felt like I plateaued. And then I started looking into the abduction phenomenon and the UFO phenomenon, and those things were always in the back of my mind, because I grew up watching Unsolved Mysteries as a kid, and like for whatever reason those cases kind of just stuck with me, because they were always just so strange. Like with a haunting, it's strange in the moment, and it'll definitely stick with you for a lifetime, but it was just so weird how these experiences could fundamentally change a person, to the point where some people end up losing their jobs or quitting their jobs because they talk about this stuff. So I was a part of a couple of different podcasts late last year that ended up falling through. And I was just, I enjoyed doing it. And I was like, man, what the heck can I do? I want to keep doing this. So slowly over time, I started to put together the Our Strange Skies podcast, which is kind of my search for what this phenomena could be, how it influences not only our culture, but our country as a whole. Like we talk about, we have like Mothman Festival, and Roswell has a festival, and all this stuff. It has a big impact on our society, and that's something I've always found fascinating. And how does it affect people in an individual way and in that larger sociological perspective. So that's what I hope to bring to this podcast and tell some interesting stories along the way. Right now, you can definitely find us on every single podcasting app and platform at this point. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Just search for Our Strange Guys. So yeah, that's really what I'm hoping to bring to this thing is maybe just look at the personal human perspective on how it affects us, because it really is so fascinating.
So to give an example of the stuff you cover on a show, I actually got this from your show because I didn't know before this, but everybody's familiar with Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But you actually went in depth, and I don't expect you to go completely in depth because people need to tune into your show and listen if they want all the details, but kind of cover briefly the different types of encounters: first encounter, second encounter, third encounter, and give us an idea of what those actually consist of.
Sure. So J. Allen Hynek is the guy that we get the close encounter scale from. He was basically studying this phenomenon from the ground floor. He was in when this became a hot button issue in 1947. So over the course of time, he develops this close encounter scale, which it's this really interesting scale designed to categorize certain sightings. So you have the close encounter of the first kind, which is basically the sighting of an object within 500 feet. So for an example of this, probably the most famous close encounter of the first kind would be the Phoenix Lights case of 1997, where hundreds of people saw this boomerang-shaped object with lights on the bottom of it over the course of 2 states from, I believe it was Arizona and New Mexico, all the way, and it ended up going down into New Mexico. And the thing was, like, even the governor of Arizona saw this thing, and at first he tried to downplay it. And he had this really hokey press conference where he had one of his staffers dress up as an alien. And years later, he recanted and he said, "No, I saw this thing, and it wasn't anything that our military had." So that's a close encounter of the first kind, just seeing an object, usually within 500 feet, but I would say 1,000 feet would still count. And even with the New York Times article that emerged in December with these military personnel having encounters in the air in fighter planes with them, those would be considered close encounters of the first kind as well. And then you get to the close encounter of the second kind, which is when there are traces detected or left, physical and even psychological. So, for instance, if you sight an object and say your car ends up stalling out, well, maybe the craft caused that. That's a close encounter of the second kind. You sight an object and your dog just starts barking like crazy. That would be considered a close encounter of the second kind. Astonishing Legends did a great 2-part episode on the Delphus ring, which is one of the most fascinating close encounters of the second kind type of cases. So yeah, just any when an object leaves some kind of trace, that's a close encounter of the second kind. And close encounter of the third kind is probably the most fun one, because it's a close encounter where you can see beings of some kind. And even when J. Allen Hynek designed this scale, he had so much trouble with this one because he had trouble accepting that people were seeing beings of any kind associated with UFOs. But there were a couple cases that ended up, convincing him that, well, this is more plausible than maybe, he first accepted. And My favorite case of all time, Lonnie Zamora. He was a cop with the Socorro, New Mexico Police Department. And one day, it's late afternoon, he's pursuing he's in a high-speed pursuit with a car, just heading south of town. And all of a sudden, his attention is caught. He hears this roaring sound. And he thinks it's the mayor's old dynamite shack that's about to blow up. So he ends up driving towards it because, that's a smart move. So he drives down this old dirt road, and he sees at first what he thinks is a car overturned. And then as he gets a little closer, what he ends up seeing is that, no, this is an oval-shaped craft that is landed. It has landing platforms, 3 of them. And there are 2 humanoids walking around outside. And eventually one of them sees him and is pretty much startled. And they get back in their craft. They lift off and they just, get away from him as quickly as possible. And that's one of those landmark cases that's hard to ignore because either you have a terrestrial object or it's a non-terrestrial object. There's no other possibility at this point. So any kind of beings associated with a craft is what we consider a close encounter of the third kind. And then the most frightening is the close encounter of the fourth kind. That's when the aliens need to back up a minute because they're getting a little too close. And that's when they're taking you out of your car or out of your bedroom, and they're bringing you up into their ship, and they're subjecting you to medical tests and a bunch of other freaky stuff. And the best documented cases, of course, are Betty and Barney Hill. And what's so fascinating about their case is that they started to document it themselves before anybody else got involved, and which is good. That's good investigation techniques for anybody who has a sighting. If you wanna dive more into it, start investigating it yourself. That's definitely a landmark case. And then we have the Travis Walton case, which is, despite all its flaws, is probably the best documented abduction case that we have because it was witnessed by 6 other people, and they couldn't find him for 5 days until he just shows back up miraculously. And what's so interesting about his case is that he doesn't think he was abducted for the reason that most people think they're abducted, for medical tests or anything like that. He thinks he was abducted because he decided to get out of his truck while him and his coworkers were heading home. They spot this object in a field. He gets out of the truck. He goes underneath the craft and he gets shot with a beam of light. Well, it knocks him back. He appears to be knocked out, and then he's taken by the craft. And what he believes is that the reason the craft took him is because it may have either severely hurt him or may have in fact killed him, and that they brought him up there to actually heal him. So that's always a fascinating aspect of that case, and it's definitely one that I think still stands the test of time, even despite some of the flaws during the investigation.
So let me ask you this about that case. That's obviously the movie, what is it, Fire in the Sky, was based on that. How accurate do you think the movie is compared to the facts that are out there?
Travis definitely had his issues because if you read the book, it's not as scary as the movie makes it out. Because it's so weird about the movie is most of it's from the perspective of his coworkers, and then you get to where they find him. He's at this payphone. And then you start to relive his encounter, and it almost starts out like the Matrix because he's in this kind of pod thing and in a room where there's a bunch of other pods, and then he gets out and He starts walking down this hallway, and then these Greys just throw him onto a table and shove something down his throat. Travis, he didn't like the depiction in that movie, but that's probably the only issue he really had with it. So that's the thing. I don't think it's a 100%, a clear depiction of it, because for a long time the narrative in Hollywood when it came to these kind of movies is like, no, these things are bad. These things are here to hurt you. I mean, from War of the Worlds, the day the Earth stood still, even though that's kind of your more peaceful example of it. But the thing, most alien movies depict aliens as being hostile, and maybe that's not the narrative we need to go for, and maybe it's starting to change with movies like Arrival. But he wasn't too much of a fan of that depiction.
All right, let's switch gears for a little bit. You mentioned before you did some paranormal investigations, and we love to have our guests tell us some of their personal paranormal stories. And I had you kind of hit and think about it beforehand and pick one or two of them out. So what have you got for us tonight?
So the case that has affected me most, and this is one that we basically had new investigators. I'm still part of a group in Central New York, the Adirondack Society for Paranormal Research. The kicker is that it's not located in the Adirondacks. It's located in Central New York, and we do zero research. So we were training some new investigators one night, and we decided that we were looking for this one area, and it was supposedly just a flat farm field of some kind, where this guy had supposedly murdered his wife and child, and his spirit could be seen dragging their bodies through the field. Like everybody in the area had stories about it, but nobody knew where it was. So we went looking and going down all these back roads and everything, and we just couldn't find it. And we stumble across this one cemetery. It's really literally down a back road, dead end road that doesn't get a lot of traffic, and it's a relatively new looking cemetery. I don't think there was a grave marker in there that was older than like 1975. And it was huge. Like it had a lot of, area left to, bury people in and stuff. And like when you pulled into it, you had a good 100 yards before you even made it to the headstones and everything. So we're driving that night in it's a red Pontiac Sunfire. And we get there, we get out, we get our equipment on, and all of a sudden we just start getting hits. Like we had K2 meters going off like crazy. Our EMF detectors were going off. And like amateur idiots, we just walked away from it and decided to go and do it in the cemetery, because ghosts don't hang out by the car.
Well, of course
they hang out in the cemetery. So we're in the cemetery for about an hour and a half. We don't get anything. There's nothing there. One team ends up going back to the car I think they wanted to grab another piece of equipment. Turned on their meters. Hey, guess what? They're going off again. Think they'd stay there. No, this is amateur hour. We're going back out in the cemetery. So we investigate for maybe another hour, and then still didn't get anything. We switched up teams at one point too. Then the guy that I was with, we were just like, well, the meters are going off by the car. Maybe we should go over to the car. Like, well, might as well. Nothing else is happening. So turn on the meters. Sure enough, they start going off. So we just stand there for a few minutes. Figure why the heck not? Nothing else is going on. And then they stop. Okay, that's weird. We move forward again, and they start going off again. And then they stop. And then we keep going around in circles around the car. And we keep following whatever this thing is around the car, and it'd keep doing the same thing. So we had a ghost box on us that night, and I'm kind of sketchy about the ghost box. Results are kind of mixed, but we got good results that night. We set it up on top of the car. We had a voice recorder like down towards the back end of the car, so it actually recorded it at a decent volume. It wasn't too overwhelming, and we kept asking what the spirit's name was, and it kept telling us 3 times. We couldn't make it out when we were in the cemetery because it was just you really needed to hear it through headphones, but we kept getting this. We knew we were talking to somebody because we kept getting the same name over and over again. And so we talked to the spirit for a while, and then eventually we just packed up because it just kept walking in around the car, which was really weird. And we listened to the audio. We figured out the spirit's name was Jeff. And he said it 3 times, and we cataloged the evidence, didn't think another thing of it. And then about 2 months later, we were there's this fall festival that we would have a table at, and we would try to drum up investigations. And where it was actually in the Holbert House, which if anybody's watched Haunted Collector, they would know that John Zaffis actually went there and removed whatever item. I don't remember which one, but the place is still mad haunted to this day. But the lead investigator pulls me aside and says, "Hey, you remember Jeff?" I was like, "Yeah, I remember Jeff." He's like, "Well, we figured out who Jeff was." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And I'm like, "Yeah." So there was a guy named... I don't remember what his last name was, but he had ended up committing suicide at the end of that dead-end road. And they kept asking around and asked, well, why would they be interested in a red Pontiac Sunfire? And the person that they asked, they said, well, his daughter had one just like it.
Oh.
So yeah, that's that case is kind of it's one of those cases that it just everything fell into place, like in ways that you don't often see with investigations like that. It's still something that I think about often,
Well, I mean, it's. Those things have a way of sticking with you, first of all, so that definitely doesn't surprise me. Rob, I'll be honest with you. It's been fun having you on. I could have you on for another hour because I've still got 1,000 different things that I'd like to ask, but I know you got things going on, and I've got things going on, unfortunately, but we're definitely going to have you back on in the future to maybe get into some specifics on some of these famous cases. Like, I don't want you to touch on it tonight, but you can give me just a yes or no answer. I've always felt like the Hill story would have gotten more play if they weren't an interracial couple at the time that this happened. Because, back when, what was this, early 60s, mid 60s? When that's
1961.
1961, and being an interracial couple was not the thing to do back in the early 60s. And I think that really hindered getting their story out. I think their story gets more play today than it ever got back then, or being taken more seriously only because of that situation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that probably does play a bit of a part, and especially with the way that John G. Fuller covers it in the book. Yeah, it's definitely a part of it for sure. Yeah.
Well, brother, I appreciate it. Tell everybody how they can catch up with you on social media.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I am on Twitter. My personal Twitter is @YourUFOGuy. The pod, yeah, like I said, it's on Twitter @OurStrangeSkies. Instagram at the same handle. We have a Facebook page, facebook.com/OurStrangeSkies. And we also have a Facebook group called In Gray We Trust, a group for those that look up into Our Strange Skies. And we post all sorts of cool stuff over there. So, come find me.
I appreciate it, Rob, and I appreciate your support on our show. I mean, you've been supporting our show several months back, about as long as I can remember. So I was excited to see you come up with your own show, and it's fantastic. So if you guys are listening to this and you like this is a really good representation of how his show flows. So that's if you like this, you'll love his show. Go subscribe to it. And I got a feeling that you'll be in all of his groups before too long and interacting with him on social media like we do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me on, man. I greatly appreciate it.
Oh, it's no problem. Like I said, I've heard you on a couple other shows. I know you were on, why am I sitting here drawing a blank? You think you would know.
I've been on
Sam
so
show.
many of them.
Sam Fredericks.
Yeah, Not Alone.
Not Alone. I drew a blank. I had it earlier and I forgot to mention it. No, I heard you on their show. You did a fantastic job on there. And
thank you, sir.
So yeah, and it's we're lucky that in Astonishing Legends, just had Chris Cogswell on. We've had Chris on. I mean, you're doing other stuff. As far as Dark Myths Collective, we've got some pretty good UFO guys between you and Chris. So. It's phenomenal. And like I said, it's not always the most fascinating subject to me until I get into the stories. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I got another hour's worth of questions to ask. So I guess I really don't know what I find interesting or not. But I think the subject alone is not interesting, but the details of specifics are interesting, if that makes any sense.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when a guy tells you the story of, hey, I traded this water with these aliens and they gave me pancakes. Well, I mean, that's just a great story. Yeah.
And I'm sitting out in the middle of the road showing them.
Yeah.
All right, brother. I appreciate it. Like I said, best of luck in your future with the podcast. It's going to be huge. I know it. It's already taken off. So just keep it going, man. And if we can be any help, we will be.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. See, Rob is really fun, and he really knows his stuff when it comes to.
Yeah, he sure does.
What is it? Ufology? Yeah, that's what it's called. Ufology. Mm-hmm. He knows his stuff, and so you need to check out his show. It really is a fun show. And while we're on the subject of checking stuff out, we have our 2 live shows coming up. One is just outside of Cincinnati in Milford, Ohio, with Mysterious Circumstances with Justin Rimmel. And, of course, we got the boys from Ohio, Nick and Rob, coming up. And we are down to, the last 20 tickets on that. What is that? So, April 14th in Milford, Ohio, 7:30. It's at a Roosters up there. So, if you like wings, they got great food. It's going to be a fun night. So, if you need to get your tickets for that, you can go to any of our sites and get the link for it right there.
Sounds great.
But I'm going to repost it probably tonight or tomorrow because I know it's been a while, so it's probably been buried. The other live show we got is selling out extremely quick. That's the Waverly deal that we're doing. That is April 28th, 2 weeks later, in Louisville, Kentucky. We have sold out the first 50 Waverly tours, which is 7:30 that night at April 28th, Saturday. And then we've already started working on the 9:30 tour, which Tracy and I are going to go on. And we've sold, I think, almost 30 tickets there. So there's only about 20 tickets left. The live show earlier that night is going to be but it will feature us. It has Mike Brown from Pleasing Terrors and Diana Denise from History Goes Bump. That is going to be a super fun show. That's at 4:30 on that Saturday the 28th. And I think we have 12 tickets left to that.
Yeah, you guys buy some tickets.
Yeah,
Come
I will post a link to that. I mention this every time, but if you're coming to the Waverly tour of the actual that you bought your tickets from Waverly Sanatorium, that does not include tickets to the live show. So if you're wanting to come to both, you're going to need to get your tickets to the live show because seating is limited. Like I said, we've only got 12 tickets left.
Oh, good.
So give that a shot. And the very last thing, we've got all of our new gear, our new logos, which people seem to really like. New sweatshirts, hoodies, T-shirts. We have 4 new designs out. It's 4, right? We got the funky red, the funky blue, the teal, the green. Yeah. And purple. It's 5 designs. So all kinds of cool stuff. Go check it out, hillbillyhorrorstories.com. And if you want to hear a bunch of our episodes on our bonus episodes, you can also find the link to our Patreon right there on our website, hillbillyhorrorstories.com. Or if you just want to make a one-time donation to the show, like some of you do on occasion, you can do that too. So,
and don't forget the iTunes reviews, which we absolutely love.
Absolutely. Next week's show, so much fun. We talked to you guys about possibly doing a reboot of some of the older shows that Ricky and I did. And we have decided that we are going to start this off with a redo of Bobby Mackey's.
Yeah.
So we've been there enough to where it made sense for this would probably be the first one. We just took a listener who came down to visit us, Jackie Getz. We took her to Bobby Mackey. She got to meet Bobby Mackey and listen to him perform. And then we got to take a little mini tour. It's about a 30-minute tour. It's not like the one they do during the day. But the one that they do during the day is about a 2-hour tour. Mm-hmm. And a group called Gatekeeper Paranormal does that. There's 3 of them, and they're going to come on the show Tuesday night and actually interview with us about all the experiences they've had while they're doing the tour. So we'll tell you the stories, but we'll also have some inside information about it. So it should be really cool. So look forward to that. Guys, we love you so much. We will see you next week.
Love you guys. Have a great week.